I was born in Philadelphia, um, and what date? October 3rd, 1956. And to my parents, Emiko Tonooka and Clarence Lawrence Morris. And I think my first home, but I don't remember because I was a baby, of course, was on Stiles Street in West Philadelphia. And I don't know the address of my first home.
How about when you lived in you grew up in
I did
Powelton
grow up in
Village?
Powelton from, like kindergarten until I was like 15, 16.
All right, what was the address there?
3716 Baring Street.
Okay,
Yeah.
Baron V.
Baring, Baring
Okay,
Street.
Baring Street.
Yeah.
Something. Okay, who were your parents? What did they do for a living? And I don't know if you want me to ask you about the Japanese internment story about your grandmother and grandmother, but you can talk about that.
Yeah. So my parents, my mother is Emiko Tonooka, and she was born in Bainbridge Island, um, and was Japanese American. First generation, meaning Nisei. So
Mm-hmm.
my grandparents were from Japan and they came here. And then she was born on Bainbridge with my uncle, who's Uncle Sinchi. So she just had one brother, and the two of them grew up really poor. They were strawberry migrant workers. And my grandfather was a farmer and also worked the land. Yeah, I think he originally, like many immigrants at that time, worked on the railroad when he first came. Kanekichi Tanoka is my grandfather's name. And my mom grew up until I guess she was 16 when they took all the Japanese American families off of Bainbridge and placed them behind barbed wire in concentration camps during World War II, as a result of President Roosevelt's executive order to have all Japanese, placed and removed. And she was one of the first families taken from Bainbridge. And um, there's a beautiful memorial on Bainbridge, and it has a plaque with my mom's name and my grandparents and my uncle and every family that was taken away. They made a plaque for who the family members were and what age they were and if they came back and not. It's beautiful. I think it's called Nitodo Nayoni, meaning never happen again. And it's taken. It is where they were taken and put onto the ferry, you know, to go to the, I guess, trains or however they got them out to the desert, and she was in Manzanar. So that's my mom, but she was an artist and a writer, and I think pretty much responsible for my becoming a jazz musician because she loved the music and introduced me to the music as a very young child. Both my parents were very proactive in supporting us and whatever we wanted to do, but my mother particularly was into the arts, and so I got a chance to see a lot of live music as a kid growing up. And by the time I was 13, my both my parents took me to see Thelonious Monk because I was a big Monk fan, and I went to the Aqua Lounge to go see him. And that was the night I decided to be a jazz musician. But then I also have my father, Clarence Lawrence Morris, who was a worker, and I would call him like a working class intellectual. My mother went to college later. My father never went to college, but he was, writing books on the theory of the beginning of the universe, and he was very esoteric guy. And he was also a Marxist and a union worker, and he worked at Campbell Soup Company, and he was a machinist, so he operated a machine at Campbell Soup. And both my parents met writing a leaflet, an anti-McCarthy leaflet during the McCarthy era. That was their first date, and the rest is history.
So you had siblings?
Yes, I have an older sister, Carla Shige Morris, And I have two brothers, David Lawrence Morris and Hideo. Who's Hideo's middle? Oh, Stephen Hideo Morris. Two younger brothers. Yeah, we're all pretty close. My sister's 4 years older, and I have two younger brothers, 2 years apart.
Now, was your family musical at all, or they just like listening to music, or?
Um, I mean, all my siblings played instruments. Yeah, so my brother played drums. My other brother plays vibes and teaches music, and he's really good vibes player, and he plays steel drums. And who else? My sister played viola for a little while, but she became a doctor, actually. She had a private practice here in Delaware
Oh,
as a pediatrician. Yeah.
all right. Tell me the growing up in Powelton Village. What kind of create an image of your mind of what it was like being a kid in Powelton Village, and just remember what were the neighbors like, what was the neighborhood like, kind of give me a description of
Sure.
that era.
Of course. So the neighborhood that I grew up in was Powelton Village, and it was very bohemian-esque, I would say. And my parents actually very concertedly and conscientiously wanted to raise their kids in that neighborhood, mostly because of the fact that it was extremely diverse, not just racially diverse, but economically diverse. So there were a lot of working class people, middle class people, there were university people, there were students, there were, black, white. We didn't stick out at all because my parents were in an interracial marriage, and so they were concerned that we were not going to be, kind of singled out or whatever, and made that. I think it was one of the best decisions actually they ever made as a married couple together, was to raise us there, because it really was like a village. People helped take care of each other. I remember just being on the street like all day long and having other people tell me to go home when it would get late, and there were lots of kids, and it was very free in a way, like not as the times were different too. You could stay out all day and play, and it wouldn't, my parents wouldn't have to like watch us. We would come home whenever, but it was very diverse, very creative. There were a lot of artists. There was a co-op across the street, people who would share a house and home. There were a lot of co-ops in Powelton at that time, and more co-ops than I think there are now in terms of people who were sharing dwellings to help survive and support each other and whatnot. And Move was there too. Move was down the street, so I lived in Powelton when the first Move thing happened, and I knew personally someone who lived right next door to them, and witnessed some of that craziness. And not that Move was crazy, but the whole thing that happened was crazy. And yeah, it was a very dynamic place. I went to Powell School, Samuel Powell School, elementary school. But my parents were radicals. They were activists, and so we went to all kinds of things. I mean, there was a Black Panther party in the neighborhood that would do a breakfast program, so I volunteered in the breakfast program, helping to cook breakfast. And at one point, my family was a recipient of food that was coming from them because we needed food. And it was very dynamic, and I mean, part of it was the times too, because growing up in the 60s, I was born in 1956, so growing up in during that time, let's say the next 15 years, was the country was just ablaze. We have the civil rights movement and the women's movement, and then there was like sexual revolution, the hippie movement, and then there was all the stuff that was going on with the music in general. I mean, I think all genres of music were having some kind of revolutionary, energetic thing happening. So the music was like, folk music, rock, funk, soul, jazz, everything, was on fire. And it was just an incredible time to be young and coming of age. And my mother, like I was saying earlier, we grew up kind of on a secretary's salary. My father worked, but sometimes he my father had a drinking problem, so sometimes, he'd spend up his check, and but considering the kinds of, I don't know, financial situation I grew up in, I'm often amazed at what my mother was able to pull off, because I went to art school. She took us to Fleischer Art School. I was at Settlement Music School. I mean, I took drama and dance, and then at one point she told me I had to make up my mind. I chose piano. And I saw so much live music. I mean, the Gino's Empty Foxhole, the university had their own jazz venue. All the colleges had their jazz venues. Then there were the clubs. I got to witness the tail end of the sort of jazz renaissance of 52nd Street and that whole time, because catching Monk at age 13 at the Aqua Lounge was like a real historical moment. And then that was just like a real, basically, dive bar pretty much. There was a tiny little acoustic piano up against the wall. It was a really crazy night because he was there on one side of the wall and then the band was on the other side. It was a little wild.
So his back was to the audience?
No, we were sitting like kind of right in front of him, but the band was to our side. So here was Monk on the left, and then the band was behind him, and then they were playing together, but Monk was sort of alone and by himself, and then the rest of the band was on the other side of the, and I don't know if it was because they didn't want to move the piano to the bar or whatever. And it was a small room. I mean, it didn't feel that much bigger than this room. It was not a very big room. It probably was bigger than this room, but I'm just saying it was not a big space. And but that evening changed my life. And I guess I pointed that night because my parents took me there for my birthday because I was a big Monk fan. But my mom had played all kinds of music in the house, all kinds, not just jazz, but jazz was her favorite. And then she took us out to hear a lot of music. So I heard blues and folk and jazz, all the jazz musicians who'd come to town. I saw most of those concerts. And then she took us to the Philadelphia Orchestra. And, when I think about all that, I'm thinking, how the heck did she get it together to do all that? I mean, not only in terms of just her energy and her wherewithal, but just financially too. I mean, we would sit in the peanut gallery at the Philadelphia Orchestra.
Academy Music.
Yeah.
We did too.
Yeah, right? Remember with the little binoculars, right? In fact, I had one of my first musical epiphanies in that space, probably by when I was about 8 years old. And I was sitting way up in the back, with the little binoculars. And my mom took me to see, she took me to see a lot of concerts, but for some reason this one really sticks out. And there was this tiny little bench in the center of the stage. And I'm thinking, what's going to happen here? And then finally this tiny little guy comes out on stage and he's holding this tiny little guitar, and he gets up and he sits on the stool. And then I'm thinking to myself, how is this supposed to work? I mean, how are we even going to hear the guy? Because we're way up there and I've got the thing on, looking through the binoculars. And then all of a sudden he just strikes the guitar. And I was I remember as a kid, just feeling struck by the sound because they had perfect acoustics. And of course it ended up being Segovia. It was Andre Segovia. Okay. And he played an all Spanish program. And it was it was like ecstasy. I mean, it was rhapsodic, and I'd never heard that kind of music. And listening to solo guitar of that caliber and quality, and then in that space, I was blown away. And I was about 8 years old. So stuff like that, I just.
Your mom started playing jazz records in the house. Now, Thelonious Monk, who else did she play? Do you remember?
She played Billie Holiday. She played Fats Waller. I love Fats Waller. I loved all of the piano players like Boogie Woogie Piano and stuff as a kid. Anything that would make me laugh, because music, Monk's music tickled my funny bone. I laugh when I listen to, even now, Monk makes me laugh. And I remember also listening once with my daughter in the car, and I think we were listening to actually Abdullah Ibrahim, and he did something really funny. And we both busted out laughing at the same time. I'll never forget that. And she was a little girl, and we both busted out laughing, excuse me. And yeah, I'm sorry, what?
No, I'm just, what else did she play? Billie Holiday? And...
Oh, yeah, right. So Pete Seeger, that was the Weavers.
Okay.
So they were really into the folk scene too, as well. What else do I remember her playing? Nina Simone. So I was a big Nina Simone fan. I always tell this story that I love, I want a little sugar in my bowl. As a kid, I was like, oh, I can like relate to that. I like sweet stuff too, having no idea, but I love Nina Simone as a kid too, and I did get to see her more than a few times, and then she played classical music too, so she had very eclectic taste, but jazz was definitely one of her favorites, and so I really grew up hearing all kinds of music. Yeah.
Now, when did you start Settlement?
When I was about 8.
Okay, tell me about it.
So initially, I think I may have even been a little younger because they had a class called Music Workshop. And I remember because they had the G clef and the bass clef painted on the floor. And the big, staff was written on the floor, and we would have to be G or B or D or on the spaces and, like run around and be one of the notes or whatever. It's funny how you remember little stuff like that. And then that kind of introduced me to all the instruments, because they do that. They introduce you to all the, reeds and brass and all the instruments. And that's when I decided I wanted to play piano. So my first episode with formal lessons, I probably had a teacher. I had a teacher named Miss Schoen, and she was very nice, but she didn't really teach me how to read music. And I was like faking it, and then one day she stopped me in the middle of a piece and she said, "Sumi, where are you?" And I was like, here. And she's like, and so she switched me to a more strict teacher, Esther Sinberg, the next year or so. And the Sinberg sisters were like notorious. So one taught violin and strings and the other one taught piano, and I was with Esther, and they were both really old school, very strict. And my first lesson with her, I came out in tears because she was like, "You can't do that." And I guess I was just completely like, faking it and kind of listening, kind of looking, and I just was not like, but she did teach me how to read music, but she also almost killed my desire to play. So, yeah. And then I had a teacher, I guess after Settlement Musical School, I had a teacher by the name of Gary Goldschneider, who was, I guess I was with him when I was like 12, 13. He was a real kind of hippie guy. He was an astrologer. He wrote a very famous book, actually, on astrology and relationships. And he was someone who would play like Beethoven sonatas, like all of them back to back in one concert where you'd have to stay up all night or whatever it was. I don't know exactly how he did and what he did, but he was very, what's the word? Extreme. Yeah, he was very extreme, but very fun to work with. He taught me a jazz song. I'm trying to remember the name of it. That's all. Da-da-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da. Is that right?
Yep.
Da-da-dee-da-da-da-dee-da-da. I remember him teaching me that. And then him telling me that if I really wanted to learn jazz, I should just be around jazz musicians and learn the music that way and not try to go to college for it or whatever. And I followed his advice because I left Philly to go study jazz. And I went to Boston, actually.
Right, and you were only 16.
Yes, yeah.
Who did you stay with up there?
I had my own place. I was working as a waitress.
That's astonishing. Tell me about that.
Well, so I mean, I could have done the same thing in Philly, but I think I needed to get out. So I was going to a school. It was an alternative school. Do you remember all the alternative schools they used to have, like Parkway and all the different? So I was going to this alternative school, and I was able to like get all my, uh, you know, credits and early. And I knew that I wanted to study music. I mean, actually, I'm skipping a big piece of my educational uh, history out, which I shouldn't because it's very kind of. So before I went to the alternative school, my parents pulled me out of public school and my little brother because they hated the public school system. And they were like, well, we're going to put you with this tutor. And this woman, her name was Janet Abbey, and she was like a Summerhill person. She was really into the Summerhill philosophy of education. And so she would like do this thing where we would go to her house and she'd say, okay, what would you guys like to learn today? And we'd be like, oh, what do you mean? You're the teacher, and she's like, well, think about it, and we're like, me and my brother, we were looking at each other like, we're going to be able to do whatever we want to do. This is cool. And I remember just like taking records over there and just listening to records all day and stuff like that. And then after a while, I was getting a little antsy and bored. And then it was like, well, what do I want to do? And I said, oh, I know what I want to do. Because at the time, macrame was really big. Do you remember? I was like, I want to learn how to do macrame. And she's like, oh, that's great. Well, how are you going to do that? And I'd be like, what do you mean? Like, you're the teacher. Like, so before you know it, I'm going to the library, getting a book out on macrame. And then we're going to the bead store and the string store. And before you know it, I'm making these little macrame this and that, and then it grows into like big wall hangings and like purses and whatever. But the whole year I was with her, it was basically about self-motivation, knowing that you can teach yourself, and really her kind of shaping that, planting the seed that I could do anything I wanted to do. We could do anything we wanted to do, and we could teach ourselves, basically. That. And so when I went to the free school, all the other kids are like smoking weed and getting high and like, they were like, whatever. And I was just like, I want to do music, So by the time I got all my credits, and I visited Boston because Gary Goldschneider told me that there was like really good teachers and schools. I went to visit Berkeley and I went to New England Conservatory, and I really decided I didn't want to learn jazz in a college environment. So I'm not exactly sure, I met Madame Shaloff, whose son was Sir Shaloff, and I ended up her place, and she's like, oh, you must move here, you can study with me. And then she got me Charlie Banakis, who is a very famous jazz pedagogist, who really did teach me pretty much how to start to play on changes, like really getting that under my belt. And so I had 2 private teachers, and then I was like working as a janitress at Harvard University, cleaning, that place, and then as a waitress and I had a couple of roommates. It was a crazy time, but I did manage to live there for about a year and a half and study and get a lot under my belt.